What I love about Dr. Max is he always gives the truth. He always cuts through the clutter, and he always shares what's important for us to know and in a way that we can understand it. It's a gift that you have, and we appreciate it very much. So welcome back to Happy Hour, Dr. Max.
Hey, I'm happy to be here. What are we going to talk about?
Well, the only thing...
really sexy topic.
I'll bet.
John is
infectious disease.
John is mad at me for the topic. It's not sexy. So
depends on the infection, I guess. But okay.
Good point.
Oh my God! Oh, and I forgot to mention he's funny. Okay. So there's been so much in the news. I know it's not our typical happy hour topic, but it's so relevant, and everybody's been talking about it. It's really very, very important that there's so much controversy now over whether people should or should not vaccinate their children. And so we want to get your take on this.
Well, I hope I don't end up blowing up any of your listeners here, but these anti-vaccine folks, they're flat worlders. They're Luddites. I don't get it. They're science
Tell us
deniers.
how you really feel.
I will tell you. I'm just getting warmed up, baby. Let me quote Jon Stewart, for example. He says these people, they're not rednecks. They're not ignorant. They practice mindful stupidity. He said, there's no red America. There's no blue America. There's just a needlessly sick America. In 2000, listen to this, in the year 2000, the CDC declared measles eradicated in the United States.
Right.
Now we've got an outbreak that's going all over the place, and guess what? It's because people aren't vaccinating their kids. This drives me nuts. So ask me all the questions about why we shouldn't be vaccinating kids, and I'll tell you exactly why all of those arguments are wrong.
You're sounding a little confident in what you have to say, Dr. Max.
Well, yeah, because I believe in science.
I
but,
know you
call
do.
me crazy.
I knew. Okay, so why are parents beginning to, more than ever, elect not to vaccinate? Why are they doing that?
Well, there's a few. I mean, first, let's deal with the autism issue first, okay? Because that was big for a while, and it was that kids get their vaccines, and around the time that they're getting a lot of these vaccines, ages around 2, although they really start getting vaccinated these days, at 6, under age 1, but they start showing signs of autism around 2 to 3, somewhere around there, where they're getting a lot of vaccines. And people said, well, obviously, it was the vaccines that caused autism. And that was then given a lot of credence by a report that was published back in the late 90s in the medical journal The Lancet, a very highly respected British medical journal, by a guy named Wakefield, who was a British researcher who said that these vaccines caused autism. Well, since then, Dr. Wakefield has lost his medical license. It turns out that the data that he presented in that paper were falsified. They were fraudulent. And the Lancet has withdrawn the paper. So there was no reason for that at all. There was no evidence at all. Then there was the issue of mercury vaccine in the vaccines. The preservative called thimerosal, which contains mercury, was in some vaccines, right? And people said, well, it must be the mercury that's causing this, that's causing the autism in these vaccines. Well, first of all, mercury's been out of childhood vaccines in this country for, close to a decade. But even probably a decade before that, Denmark took all mercury out of childhood vaccines, and their rate of autism continued to go up, just like it has in this country. There was no correlation whatsoever between mercury and vaccines, or mercury rather, in vaccines and autism. In fact, one of the vaccine experts that I spoke to about this said, based on the fact that you took mercury out of the vaccines and autism went up, maybe we ought to put mercury back into the vaccines. I think he was joking, by the way.
Right. But the point is, it's not a factor.
It's not a factor. There just is no reason. There's no correlation between autism and vaccines or mercury in vaccines whatsoever. Then so another argument is, well, they get so many shots, it overwhelms their little immune system. First of all, we're talking about kids, right? Talking about babies and kids. Right. Kids eat dirt. Kids, the binky drops on the floor. What does mom and dad do? They pick it up, they lick it, and they give it back to the kid. A child is confronted with hundreds of thousands of immune challenges every single day. So the idea that a dozen shots might somehow overwhelm their immune system is nonsense. We're surrounded by bacteria and viruses, and kids are getting these viruses and bacteria into their system every single day that their immune system responds to, as it should respond to that. So the idea that their immune system gets overwhelmed by these shots, it's nonsense. It just doesn't. It's just a fundamental misunderstanding of how the immune system works and all of the challenges that we're faced with here. And the other thing is, we've forgotten, because we're now in this post-vaccine world where these diseases have become sort of a distant memory. We've forgotten how serious some of these things were. When I was growing up, this is when the polio vaccine came in, and I was lucky that I was one of the early kids who got the polio vaccine. But parents today have forgotten there used to be wards in hospitals with children in iron lungs from paralytic polio.
Wow.
And polio still exists in the world. It's wild polio, mostly in distant lands. But this is how, with the jet age, polio can arrive in our shores, with a little quick transatlantic flight. So just because it's not in this country doesn't mean it can't arrive here. The measles vaccine and the measles epidemic that has hit California probably arrived from the Philippines. They genetically tested the measles that the kids at Disneyland were getting, and it turns out it's the same genotype, the same genetic fingerprint as a measles that started in the Philippines. So all it takes is one quick jet flight across where somebody who hasn't been vaccinated is infected, and next thing you know, it's all over the place. Mm-hmm. And by the way, measles, people think of measles, well, what's the big deal? You get a rash, you get a fever, and you're fine. Do you know who the author is, Roald Dahl?
No.
He wrote Charlie and the Chocolate Factory.
Oh.
He wrote James and the Giant Peach. He wrote Matilda. Beloved children's books, right? He's the author.
Yeah.
His daughter died of measles.
Oh, no.
Oh, my God.
His daughter contracted measles right before. It was in 1962. It was right before the measles vaccine came out in 1963. 7-year-old daughter, Olivia, contracted measles, got measles encephalitis, and died.
Wow.
So don't ever tell me, and don't ever tell him, that people, that measles, is a minor disease.
But Doctor,
the other here, go ahead.
So I had a question. If your kid,
I could rant forever on this.
No. I'm actually enjoying this, and I thought it was going to be unsexy. Who knew? But let's say you're a parent of a child and you got your kid vaccinated, and your kid is going to school and sitting next to a child who's not vaccinated. Shouldn't you feel secure in the fact that your child's vaccinated? So, who cares if little Susie Cream Cheese didn't get vaccinated sitting next to your kid?
Well, Susie Stupid Cream Cheese here's the problem. What you're talking about is herd immunity, HERD. If enough people in a community or in the herd are vaccinated, then even the unvaccinated kids are protected, right? Well, what happens is when the immunization rate in the community, in the herd, drops below a certain level, then the unvaccinated kids are no longer protected because there's just not enough immunity in the herd, but also because no vaccine is 100%, okay? Nobody's saying that. No vaccine is 100%. And some kids just don't make enough antibodies and respond well enough, even if they've been vaccinated. So if you've got unvaccinated kids in the classroom, even your vaccinated child might be at risk because you don't know whether or not they are really fully protected. And the vaccination rates now in some of these schools in California, in Hollywood in some places, are equivalent to, hang on, I've got it here in front of me. The immunization rates there are lower or equivalent to the immunization rates in Chad and South Sudan.
Oh, my goodness. And we have access to this, and we're choosing not to.
Right.
Exactly. I looked up just before it came. We got on the air. I looked up on the World Health Organization list of vaccination rates for measles in the world. Right, the U.S. has a lower measles vaccination rate than Uzbekistan, Vietnam, Zimbabwe, Libya, and Albania, among others. Those are just the ones that I picked out. They have better measles vaccination rates than we do in this country, and that's the national rate. Never mind if you start looking at some of the schools or these personal belief exemptions are rampant in some places out in Hollywood and California. It just makes no sense to me that we have the ability to prevent these diseases, and we're not taking advantage of it for reasons that have really nothing to do with science.
Well, and I think every single parent is making a decision they think that they believe is best for their children. It's not that I think overwhelmingly people are being careless. They have these beliefs, but the scary part is they're working off of bad information. You just took every reason that people have for not vaccinating, and you debunked every one of them.
I mean, that's the issue, is that they're doing it based on some sort of gut feeling, some sort of personal belief that really has no basis in science, or they think they're basing it on some sort of evidence or science that has been discredited, like the entire connection between mercury and autism, or the number of vaccines and autism. It just because a couple of things happen at about the same time doesn't mean that it's a cause and effect. A lot of things happen at about the same time that didn't end up causing autism, and we're learning all sorts of things about autism that really indicate that it's not related. It's not related to vaccines. Now, what I do want to say is that just like every other medical procedure, every antibiotics, everything else, there is a risk, a vanishingly small risk, as the doctors say. There is a risk to vaccines, and one in tens, if not hundreds of thousands of kids will have a bad reaction to a vaccine. That does happen. So I don't want to tell you, I don't want to imply that this is 100% protective or 100% safe. But like everything else, it's a risk versus a benefit. The risk of getting the vaccine is tiny, 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 versus the risk of actually getting sick from some of these diseases is much, much greater. So that's the balancing act there. You know, you can't take the one case in hundreds of thousands and point to that and say, aha, see, that's why I don't want to immunize my kid, because he's got a much greater risk of catching a very serious disease otherwise.
Dr. Gomez, we just had somebody text in a question for you, if you don't mind.
Okay.
How long does immunity last after you've had the measles? Oh, so after you've actually had the disease.
But that's actually a very good question. If you got what we call wild type measles, like I did, I got measles when I was a kid before the vaccine was around.
That's the kind I would have got.
Right. And if you do the math, you can probably figure out how old we all are. If you got that, it's probably the case that you have lifelong immunity. But again, since there's not a lot of wild measles floating around, and nobody's really tested that in a way that would be scientifically valid. And if you are going, even if you got wild measles, if you're going off to a country where measles is endemic, some people say that it might be worth getting a measles booster. Right. Now, if you got the measles vaccine, that, there is some evidence that might not be lifelong immunity. And that as you grow into, middle age or whatever, it might not be a bad idea to get a booster if there is measles floating around in the community. Now, back in 2000, there was almost no measles. It was considered eradicated in the U.S. Now there's more of it around, so now adults might want to consider getting a booster if you got the vaccine, as opposed to actually catching the measles when you were a young kid.
Was there ever a time, or do any of the Dr. Max, you know the extent of my offspring is a dog. So I don't have children to know this. But do any of the schools, do they require before kids get enrolled proof of certain immunizations?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's a law in all 50 states. However, certain states, it varies from state to state whether you are allowed to file for what's called, most places call them PBEs, personal belief exemptions. In some cases, it's allowed for religious beliefs, although to my knowledge, there is no religion that prohibits vaccinations. Well, maybe I take that back. I think Christian Scientists and Seventh-day Adventists might. I can't say that I'm familiar enough with the teachings to know whether or not they allow immunizations. But there are a lot of states, including California, where filing a quote-unquote personal belief exemption is actually quite easy to do. You just have to sign a piece of paper that says, I don't believe in vaccines, and therefore my kids are let off the hook. There are only 2 states in the union. West Virginia is one, and now I've forgotten the other one. Might be Mississippi, but I can't swear, that do not allow any exemptions at all other than for medical reasons. There are some kids who, for medical reasons, if they're getting chemotherapy for cancer, they have certain immune deficiencies, those kids should not get certain vaccines because that could be dangerous for them. But those are the only 2 states that allow no other exemptions. Every other state allows some exemptions. In some cases, they're pretty easy to get. In some cases, they're harder. There's a move now to make it much harder to get these PBEs, as they call them, these personal belief exemptions, so that people have to jump through a lot more hoops and prove that there's some real issues there before they're allowed to simply sign a piece of paper and say, I don't want my kid vaccinated.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. So here's the problem. What's the answer? One of which is you and your opportunity to spread the word to people. And I'm glad we had the chance for you to do that tonight. But what do you do? I guess the states might start getting stricter about those requirements.
Well, some schools, the private schools can kind of set some of their own restrictions above and beyond what the state does. Private schools can say, no vaccines, no school. Public schools pretty much obviously have to follow whatever the state laws are. So you can lobby schools all you want, but basically their public schools are usually, their hands are kind of tied by whatever the state law is. So there you have to go to your state legislature and say, listen, I need my kid protected. And there was another case out in California recently where the parents were saying, the fact that kids in their child had some sort of immune deficiency and being vaccinated was medically very dangerous for him. So he would go to school, and they were saying, look, if the kids in my kid's class are not vaccinated, you're putting my child's life at risk. So I want everybody in my kid's class to be vaccinated because otherwise my kid could die if your kid brings in the measles. So, it gets complicated, but this is not freedom of speech or personal freedom like some people are trying to portray it. This is public health. This is a public health issue. And for many, many years, we have had public health laws that allow people, for example, when it was tuberculosis, public health officials could follow up with people with STDs. You could do what's called contact tracing. There, we have a long history of public health, that the public health overrides what the so-called personal freedoms here, because it's not, no man is an island. Just because you don't want to get vaccinated doesn't mean that you're the only one who might get sick. You're putting everybody else at risk, and that's why the public health overrides your freedom to choose to get sick.
I get mad if somebody behind me on the train sneezes. I get pissed.
How did I know that?
I know.
Dr. Max, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us and share this with our listeners. Where